Welcome to this lesson of today. Still, I remain teacher Agwata Simon Peter. I'm going to take you through English. And today, we are going to look at poetry. If we don't say poetry, we can say poems. Now, poetry is one of the aspects that is tested in your papers. Now, when we look at the word poetry, we must understand what it is. Poetry, let's first see these terms. One, we have poetry. Two, we have poem. Three, we have poet. Four, we have poetess. You'll ask me why I put that. Next, we have stanza. If you don't want to call it stanza, you can call it verse. Then we have what we call lines. Also, we have the word anonymous. So these are some of the common words they use when they are asking you questions concerning a poem. Now, first of all, you need to know what poetry is. Then, two, you need to know what a poem is. Three, you must know who a poet is. And four, you must also know who a poetess is. However, this one is becoming informal. So nowadays, we use a poet for both. We use a poet for both. So when someone asks you about a poetess, it is becoming informal English. Then stanza and verse, you must know what lines are in a poem. Then you must know what the word anonymous means. The word anonymous, other words that can mean anonymous. Other words. To mean anonymous are one, unknown. We can also say not known. Or you can just say not mentioned. These are other words to mean what? Anonymous. And at times, they can also ask you to write this in full. The full form of, the short form of anonymous is that. Then the full form of unknown is anonymous. So when some poems are written, but they don't give the person or the author or the writer. So when such poems have been given and you're asked, who is the writer of this, of the above poem? You don't say anonymous is the writer, but you say the writer of the above. The writer of the above poem is anonymous. But we don't say anonymous is the writer of the above poem. So the word anonymous can come last. If not, you can also say the writer of the above poem is unknown. Or you can say the writer of the above poem is not known, or not mentioned, or not given. Any word related to anonymous can qualify for that. So now let's go through this one. What is poetry? What is poetry? Yes, what is poetry? One can say poetry is the meaningfully meaningfully. Poetry is the meaningfully arranged. The meaningfully arranged patterns of words. Patterns of words. Meaningfully arranged pattern of words which give imaginative. Which give imaginative feeling, which give imaginative feeling and powerful emotions of human experience. That is poetry. Is the meaningfully arranged patterns of words which give imaginative feeling and powerful emotions of human experience. One can also define poetry as poetry is the study. Poetry is the study of poems. Is the study of poems as a whole. Is the study of poems as a whole, or as a form of literature. One can also say poetry is the study of poems as a whole. Just look at it as a poem. Or is the study of literature as a form of literature. Is the study as a form of literature. You study a poem as a whole, or if not, as a form of literature. For those of you who are going to go to higher levels of education, you're going to do literature as a subject. So that we can define poetry in that manner. The next word we are to define from here is a poem. What is a poem? We can say a poem is a piece of creative writing. Is a piece of creative writing in verse or stanza. In verse or stanza. In verses. Let's have that. In verses or stanzas. In verses or stanzas, used to express deep feelings or thought. Deep feelings or thoughts. Yes, used to express deep feelings or thoughts. To communicate, it's slightly long. To communicate. An experience. To communicate an experience to a higher level. To a higher level. A poem is a piece of creative writing. It's just creative writing in verses or stanzas used to express deep feelings or thoughts, to communicate an experience to a higher level. So now the next word we have to look at here is a poet. We are looking at terms in relation to poetry. 3, we have to look at a poet. So here we're going to say a person. A person, we can say maybe a man or a woman. A man or a woman who writes poems. There are normally 2 questions that they prefer asking you under this. They can ask you, who is the poet in the poem? Then, who is a poet? The difference in these questions is article A, the poet. The poet and a poet. This one with the article A wants you to give the definition. Wants you to give the what? The definition. Then this one with the wants you to mention the name. So you should not confuse the 2. When they say who is the poet, you must mention the name. Then if they ask you who is a poet, you're supposed to define the word poet. So a poet is a person, whether a man or a woman, who writes poems. We say the poetess is becoming informal English. However, by then they would say a poetess is a woman who writes poems. But now, modern English, we combine both. A poet is either a man or a woman who writes poems. So let's look at the next. We have here stanza or verse. What do we mean by stanza or verse? A stanza is a group of lines. A group of lines. Stanza is a group of lines in a repeated pattern. In a repeated pattern. Stanza is a group of lines in a repeated pattern that form a unit. That form a unit. Is a group of lines in a repeated pattern that form a unit. That is, here they always ask you, how many stanzas does the poem have? So they want you to say the number of those repeated lines forming a unit. Okay, let's move. 5 lines. Lines. We can say this, the words of an actor. These are the words of an actor. These are the words of an actor. They are what we call lines. So you've known what poetry is. You've known what a poem is. You've known who a poet is. Then you've known what the word stanza or verse means. Then you've now known what the word lines mean. Now, if you are given a poem, what do we test in poems? What do we test in poems? You ask yourself that question. You are given a poem, but what do they test in poems? What do they test in poems? One, they test for what the poem is, what the poem is about. Or they can just ask direct, what is the poem about? This is always the first question that you are asked, what the poem is about. After they have asked what it's about, two, they are asking for the deeper meaning of the words used in the poem. The deeper meanings, the deeper meaning of the words used in the poem. Then three, they are also testing for the poetic language. The poetic language. What are some of the poetic languages they use here? Here they may mean the simile. When I talk about a simile, that is the use of us. They may be testing for the metaphor. These are figures of speech. They may be testing for the mood in the poem. The writer of the poem, how is the writer of the poem feeling? That is what we mean by the mood in the poem. Was the writer of the poem happy? Was the writer of the poem sad? What was the mood of the writer of the poem? Then they can also be testing for the irony, like those who read novels. Yes, those who read novels, and the author of the poem might use a certain phrase to mean something different. That's what we mean by the irony. Yeah? Yes, so they might be testing for the poetic language, the simile, that's the use of others, the metaphor, you are meaning something, you are saying something, but you're meaning something very different. Then they might be asking you whether you know the mood of the poet, then the irony, and so on. So they can also be asking for the rhythm and the pace. Rhythm and pace in the poem. What do you mean by rhythm? How the writer expresses the feeling in the poem, the attitude. Okay? So, they might also be checking for the use of the punctuation. Use of the punctuation marks. Yes. Do you know how to read those lines when the punctuation marks are there? Where there is a comma, do you make a pause? Where there is an exclamation, do you read your sentence exclaiming? So, you must also have that. Then, you should also know the writer. You should also know the writer. If you want to call it the writer, you can call it the poet. If you don't want to call it so, you can also call the author of the poem. Like I told you, some poems are given without writers, without authors, without poets. So you must be able to identify whether a poem has that. Then the next thing is the mood. The mood and the tone. Mood and tone of the writer. The mood and the tone of the writer. Yes, as you've said it from somewhere here. So, the next thing they test is how those words are arranged in the poem. So now, what should we do when we want to answer questions concerning a poem? So we can say tips to follow, when answering tips to follow when answering a poem. Things you're supposed to do when you're answering questions concerning a poem. Okay? Things you're supposed to do when you're answering questions concerning a poem. The first thing that you're supposed to do is to read the given instruction carefully. Read the given instruction carefully. Read the given instruction carefully. Like you will see, a poem is going to be displayed and it will be running below your screen there. So the instruction for this poem that you're going to see down is read the poem below. The poem below is about peace and security in our land. Read it carefully and answer the questions that follow correctly. That is the instruction they normally give. So you must read the given instruction carefully. After you've read the given instructions carefully, you have to read through the poem. Read through the poem carefully. Read through the poem carefully and understand the message communicated. Yes, you must read through the poem carefully and you understand the message communicated. After you've read through your poem carefully and you've understood the message communicated, then you identify the title. You have to identify the title. If you don't want to call it the title, you can call it the topic. If you want to call it the topic, you can call it the theme of the poem. Very important. Some poems are given without themes, others are given without topics, others are given without titles. But as a candidate, you must be able to identify the title of the given poem after you finish reading. If you've been helped and you're given the title, well and good. So next, after the title, you identify the poet. You identify the poet. Yes, or the author. You identify the poet or the author. If not, you can call him the writer of the given poem. You remember I told you some poems don't have authors, some poems don't have writers. So if the writer is not there, we say the writer of the poem is anonymous. So we move on. After you have identified the writer, the author, and the poet, what do you do next? The next thing you do, that is number 5. The next thing you do, you underline the keywords in the poem. Underline the keywords. Underline the keywords in the poem. Yes. they help you. If you've underlined those keywords in the poem, they help you to understand their meanings very well. Yes? Next, we have to refer back to the poem. Refer back to the poem when answering. When answering, refer back to the poem when answering the given questions. When answering the given questions. Yes, keep on referring back to the poem when answering the given questions. Let's move on. After that, you have to identify the person speaking in the poem. Identify the person speaking. Identify the person speaking in the poem, or the speaker. Identify the what? The speaker. In most cases, some poems are given when it is something else talking, maybe an animal, maybe a pair of shoes, and so on and so on. So you have to identify the person speaking in the poem. Yes. Next, after identifying the person speaking in the poem, how do we do this? We can identify the person speaking in the poem with the help of pronouns. With the help of pronouns. When I talk of pronouns, I mean words like he, she, it, they, we. Those are pronouns. So they must have been used, or they might have been used in your poem. After you have identified the speaker, then you answer should be, the answer should be informative, meaning you answer what you've been given. The answer should be informative. Answer what you've been asked. Don't answer what you've not been asked. Then questions starting with or ending. There are two statements here. Starting with or ending in. According to the poem. According to the poem. When you're answering such questions, depending on the position of according to the poem, they must appear in your response. They must appear in your response. So we say that questions starting with or ending in according to the poem should be maintained. Should be maintained. Depending on the position, depending on its position, depending on its position in the sentence. What do we mean? There comes a time where you're asked, according to the poem, like take an example of a question that is asked saying, according to the poem. Yes, let me just get one from our poem. According to the poem, how has peace? According to the poem, how has the poet described peace. So you can see the position of according to the poem is at the beginning. So our response also should be according to the poem, comma, the poet has described peace as slippery. Then that very question can also be changed. And then they say, how has the poet described the peace according to the poem? You see the position of according to has changed to the last. So you also say the poet has described the peace as slippery according to the poet. According to the poem. So you maintain that. So that we are about to finish. Then question starting with why do you think? Questions starting with why do you think? These are opinion questions. Or one can also ask, in your opinion. Yes, it's the same as asking, why do you think? In your opinion, it's the same as asking, why do you think? So when you're answering such questions, you start your answer by saying, I think, because the question is asking for your opinion. Then after saying I think, you continue like that. Then second last, in case you are asked, lastly, in case you are asked to write the title, yes? In case you are asked to write the title must be written in capital letters. It must be written in capital letters. Titles must be written in capital letters. Titles must be written in capital letters depending on the question asked. Depending on the question asked. Yes, because there comes a situation where they are going to ask you, what is the title of the poem? They are not going to give you answer in brief. You have to say, the title of the poem is maybe the title of the poem is, my question here is, what is the title of the poem? Then my response is, the title of the poem is, I have to write it in capital letters, peace, yes, and security. Peace and security. But if my question was, suggest, give the suitable title to the poem, the word suggest, give, mention does not require you to write your answer in full sentence. There you just come and drop your response in capital letters, peace and security. Peace and security. You don't need a full stop there. Okay? So, then what must you do when you are answering? Still here, you must check your spellings. The spellings of the words that you're going to write must be correct. You must also mind about your handwriting, because handwriting matters, okay? It is what gives you marks. If you're writing words that cannot be clearly read by the examiner, then you're going to miss marks. Be careful with the verbs. Actually, let me make that to be the last point. Let me make that to be the last point. Let me make that to be the last point. 11. Be careful. Be careful with. Be careful with the verbs. Be careful with the verbs and tenses. Be careful with the verbs and tenses used in the poem. Used in the poem and questions. Be careful with the verbs and tenses used in the poem and the questions. Okay? Be careful with the tenses and verbs used in the poem and the questions. Now, you're going to read that poem down there. Then you'll find questions like, what has happened to our land? That question is in the present perfect tense. So you're not going to say, our land had. You get the point? You must respond to that question in the present perfect tense form. Then there's this question. Who are hunting humankind? Who are hunting? The question is in the present. You are not going to say, dash and dash dash, were. No, it must be are hunting. So that's why we're saying, be careful with the verbs and the tenses used in the poem and the questions. So the poem is going to be running down there. Make sure you read it, practice these steps. I hope when you do that, you're not going to find problems with the poems. Thank you so much for listening. I wish you the best.